a change in DC ripple all the way through to your state house. Grab your policy surfboard. We're riding the federal to state wave. When President Trump came back into office, he didn't just shake up Washington. He rewrote the federal government's anti-discrimination policies for people in the LGBTQIA+ community, including how federal government defines sex and gender. And when that happens, states don't just watch, they react. Some followed his lead, others flat out defied it. Today, we're unpacking what it looks like and why it's an example of how federal policy trickles down to state regulation. Today, we're trying something a little bit different, talking to an expert. I'm so pleased to be joined by Dr. Jennifer Crosswhite. Jennifer has a doctorate in human development and family science and 20 years of analyzing how social and family policies impact families. She taught social and family policy while in academia and led the policy department for a national academic association as the Senior Director of Research, Family, and Policy Education. Now, she is the Social and Policy Analyst here at BuildTrack 50. Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you, Sarah, for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yay! All right, let's dive in. So, Jennifer, you dove into 85 different regulatory notices across 14 states. I have to ask, on a scale from mild curiosity to policy nerd joy, how excited were you about that spreadsheet?
I am very much land on the side of a policy nerd joy.
Okay.
I get excited about analyzing social and family policy and thinking about the impact that policy has on individuals, families, and communities. And for our topic today, I was incredibly curious about how red and blue states responded to the current administrative policies removing federal protections for people in the LGBTQIA community.
That is incredibly interesting, and we're going to find out just how interesting today. So let's start with the federal fireworks, as we can say. What are these new executive orders? I feel like so many of these came down when we were kind of in executive order mayhem or at the earlier part of this year. And how have these changed the landscape for gender policy nationwide?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sarah. So with the sweep of a pen on day one, President Trump signed executive orders rescinding policies from the previous administration, including those related to gender identity and the removal of federal protections and health equity for people within the LGBTQIA community. Specifically, the new executive orders recognize two sexes, male and female. They also state that gender cannot be used as a replacement for sex and that the government will not provide taxpayer dollars for gender affirming care. The White House then argued that prior regulation had blurred legal distinctions, undermining laws protecting women in single sex spaces, and created inconsistencies in education, healthcare, and other settings. The administration also argued that children need protection from what they describe as harmful and irreversible medical interventions. Now, I would be remiss, Sarah, if I didn't note that these efforts to reinterpret the federal policies affecting individuals within the LGBTQI community have been widely publicized and met with a lot of vocal opposition from advocacy groups. And I actually share a great resource in the blog that I wrote about this particular topic on how the executive orders may harm the LGBTQIA plus community. So I really encourage your listeners to read that blog, but also to check out that resource to really understand the implications that these executive orders have had on LGBTQ people.
Yes, absolutely. And you can read that blog on BuildTrack50.com. But okay, so there were so many EOs mentioned in your piece, and like I said, there was just a deluge of them of day one. So can we walk through them kind of one by one and what each of these actually do?
Yeah, absolutely. So with my search, I found that there were 31 executive orders and federal regulation notices that included language around gender and gender affirming care. So I really dove into 3 executive orders that kind of appeared to be at the beginning of the current administration's reversal on affirming gender policy. So the first one was Executive Order 14148, which is titled Initial Rescissions of Harmful Executive Orders and Actions. And what this executive order did is it revoked several Biden-era protections for individuals in the LGBTQIA plus community. Specifically, It ended Executive Orders 13988, 14020, 14021, and 14075. Those are a lot of numbers. So what does that mean? Right. Those focus on preventing discrimination for LGBTQIA people, and also talking about revoking the Gender Policy Council, revoking protections in education and equality for individuals within the LGBTQI community. So that was the first one. That one was signed on day one.
Okay.
Also signed on day one was Executive Order 14168. This one's titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth. I put quotes in there. And they use biological definition a lot. And so that I am putting that in quotes. So they established this biological definition of sex in federal policy. And specifically, what they're stating is that it's the policy of the United States to recognize two sexes, male and female, and that the word sex then should be used in all of their policies as opposed to the word gender. And what they said is that sex is immutable and grounded in fundamental and incontrovertible reality, whereas gender does not provide a meaningful basis of identification.
Okay.
I'm going, I don't know how you put that in words.
Yeah.
But they framed this as protecting women's spaces and then also clarifying federal law. They further said that the executive branch will endorse all sex protected laws to protect this reality. So removing those gender protections.
Very interesting take.
Yep, it is. It very is. And we're seeing that have a ripple effect for sure. And even within the Supreme Court ruling just yesterday, as it relates to visas, and that the Supreme Court ruled that, yes, this change can go forward for right now, and that people must identify as male or female, and they can no longer indicate an X on their visa to allow themselves to identify as non-binary or transgender.
Hot off the press, Jennifer.
It really is. And then we have the third executive order that I really looked at, and this is 14187, protecting children from, quote, chemical and surgical mutilations. So this executive order stated the federal government will not fund, sponsor, promote, assist, or support gender affirming care for minors under 19. And rather than using that term gender affirming care, they use the phrase chemical and surgical mutilation. So quite a bit different. They define chemical and surgical mutilation to include puberty blockers, hormones, and surgeries used allowing individuals to align their physical appearance with their identity that may differ from their biological sex. The rationale for this executive order was to protect children from what the administration described as harmful and irreversible medical interventions that could lead to sterilization and lifelong medical complications. They further directed the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to improve the health of minors experiencing, quote, gender confusion without the use of chemicals or surgical mutilation.
All right. So this is a huge shift. And this is also something that I feel like I've been seeing a ton in policy, especially over the last 10 years, of just policy written with such intense language. If you weren't hot on this topic and knew so much about it, you would look at something like chemical surgical mutilation and identify that with a child and be like, what in the heck is going on? Absolutely, we don't want that. That's so scary. And this language like biological truth, it's almost like giving us alternate facts kind of vibes. It's a little bit hard to fight against, but it's also confusing, and they're really trying to make up new definitions and harsh boundaries. So was this mainly symbolic, or does this really have real teeth other than, how somebody might perceive this type of things? And is this changing how federal agencies are starting to act?
Yeah, I agree. This is a huge shift from previous administrations with one caveat. So President Trump did issue two presidential memoranda in 2017 and 2018 prohibiting transgender individuals from serving in the military and halted the use of Department of Defense or Department of Human Services resources to fund reassignment, surgical procedures, military personnel, except to the extent necessary to protect the health of individuals who had already begun their course of treatment to reassign their sex. And so meaning except if they had already started going through gender affirming care.
Okay.
And then President Biden issued an executive order on January 25th of 21 that fully reversed that
Mm.
memoranda. So then lots of protections during the Biden era. We come into 2025, and like you've been saying, there's been just this onslaught of executive orders. We've seen not only executive orders, but presidential proclamations,
Mhm.
orders for federal agencies such as the Departments of Human Services, Transportation, Education, Defense, and Labor to implement those executive orders throughout their agencies. And so I found those 31 executive orders and notices and also requests for information that all related to the current administration's approach
Mhm.
toward federal protections against discrimination toward people within the LGBTQI community. And then I also found an additional 54 state regulatory notices that either introduced or finalized state regulatory changes, with some of those notices supporting the federal changes, while other states introduced or finalized regulatory changes that were counteracting the federal changes.
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot going on here. And once these EOs dropped, how long did it take before the state started responding? Was this something that was pretty immediate? I do remember all of the advocacy groups immediately, no, this one, no, this one. But then again, there was so many of them, it kind of got lost in the sauce, in my opinion, of how much was happening. But were they ready to move, or did this just kind of catch everyone off guard? Did Project 2025 kind of set people up to thinking that this was going to happen? What's happening?
Yeah, well, Project 2025 is a whole other
Yeah,
podcast for sure.
very
And
true.
I would say it definitely gave people a heads up on what
Okay.
was to come. And we would see the advocacy groups were definitely ready to
Hmm.
start responding. And immediately after those executive orders dropped, then we saw a lot of lawsuits being
Yeah.
filed.
Hmm.
Which brings us back to the Supreme Court case that I talked about earlier, because a lawsuit was filed against one of the executive orders, 14168, I believe it is. But, anyways, they filed a lot of lawsuits, and so they're seeing that play out. But within the states, the regulatory responses appeared within weeks, especially for the state of Massachusetts, who had started issuing emergency notices to protect the medical professionals who provide gender affirming care and to also protect their patients from legal repercussions. So, using Bill Track 50's regulation tracker, I discovered that there were 85 relevant notices
Hmm.
across the 14 states and at the federal level. What that means is that 28% of the states issued gender related rules post inauguration. And
Hmm.
of those, half of them aligned with Trump's policy direction, 43% opposed his
Okay.
direction, and one state, Washington, did both.
Oh.
But what's also important to mention is that 36 states, or 72% of the states, did not issue gender related rules post inauguration.
Okay, so a lot of the states actually haven't introduced anything new, which gets into something that we talk a lot about here, which is preemption and how states can default or not default with federal rules, this, that, the other. We also talk a lot here about how we are a patchwork nation and how all of the states are now having different laws and it's kind of getting confusing and there's a lot of different stuff going on there. So this is actually quite fascinating that, all right, we've seen a decent amount, but honestly not that much. There's been a lot of huge changes and huge kind of opinions put forth by these executive orders, and it's almost a perfect split among states that have issued rules. And are they trying to do more protections, or are they kind of siding with the Trump administration, which makes this all confusing and weird, right? So if you can give us a quick roll call. I think I know how this is going to go, but who's on which team here?
Yeah, yeah, and for the most part, it is going to go according to how you might assume, with a couple of exceptions.
Okay.
So, Alabama, Iowa, Mississippi, Utah, West Virginia, and Wyoming were all aligned with the current administration's policies. There was a little bit with respect to New York and a little bit of Washington, which I'll explain both of those. And Colorado, Illinois, Massachusetts, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Texas, and then again a little bit of Washington
Yeah.
were in opposition of the current administration's executive orders. So New York and Washington really aren't as straightforward as
Okay.
saying yes or no. New York was identified as aligned with the federal executive orders because the state ruled that all gender affirming hormone treatments must be prescribed in person only. This was deemed in support of the current administration's policy, as New York rule may hinder some
Mm,
individuals from receiving their gender affirming treatments, right?
okay.
If they can't make it to the office for whatever reason, then they're not going to be able to have their gender affirming treatments. New York as a whole really is quite supportive of gender affirming care. It was
Okay.
just that little bit that makes it more difficult for individuals to obtain their gender affirming treatments or their
Okay.
care. And then we'll talk about Washington in a little bit later.
Okay. I can't wait. But okay, wait, I need to back up for a second. Texas made the opposed list. That is definitely not
Right.
something that I expected to see.
Right. Yeah, I was really, really surprised about that as well. And so this is another one of those similar to New York where it's not as straightforward. So Texas issued rules allowing licensed marriage and family therapists to earn professional continuing education credits in the content area of cultural diversity,
Okay.
which includes gender identity, and sexual orientation. Now, when
Mm,
they this and they asked for comments, and the comments that were submitted during that comment period were about removing that particular language
oh,
because people didn't like that
yeah.
language. The rule wasn't changed though, because people are not required, number one, to take cultural diversity continuing education credits, nor are people required to take continuing education credits on the topic of gender identity, or sexual orientation. There's other topics even within the content area of cultural diversity that a person could take those professional development opportunities. And so this rule allows for people who want to take continuing education credits on gender identity, and sexual orientation to be able to do so and
Mm,
have those credits count toward their continuing education requirements for being a licensed marriage and family therapist. So it just is allowing people to do that if they want to, but nobody's forcing it. And so therefore it's a positive.
okay. Okay. We're in the details, we're in the nuance. Let's go on a little road trip. So, you pulled out some examples that really show how this has played out in different ways across different states around the country. Can we just do kind of a highlights reel?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we'll start with Alabama. You wrote that there was this library regulation that was there that bans gender ideology.
Right. So we're talking specifically about Regulation 520-2-2
Mm.
dot zero three. And
Okay.
basically what this regulation says is it labels materials that promote, in quotes, gender
Mm.
ideology or depicts more than two genders as inappropriate for children and must be placed in a location where children and youth do not have access. So
Mm.
essentially, this regulation is a content restriction, but it's framed as youth protection.
Ah, yes. We've talked a lot about different types of framing this year and how the politics have kind of figured out what marketing is now. All
Yeah,
right,
yeah, that's a good
so
move
we're
on it.
regulating bookshelves. That's not something that's super new, but it's definitely getting more and more common as the years progress. And I can already kind of see the quiet section debate heating up here. So let's now move to Iowa. This one was wild to me because it's literally a find and replace job.
Right, that's exactly right. So Iowa changed the word gender to sex across multiple administrative codes, everything from health, vital records. And while this change did not directly refer to Executive Order 14168, the change is definitely consistent with that specific executive order, eliminating the term gender and instead using that term sex. Interestingly, this did pass, and so it does go into effect on December 1st, so just in a few weeks.
Okay, that's a small edit, more or less, with ginormous implications,
Yeah.
which I think is a lot of this. But we're continuing on this choo-choo train. We're in Mississippi now. And they went all in, right?
Yeah, it seems so, at least within the across education.
Okay.
So Mississippi introduced and passed three different education regulations, basically banning any programming or offices promoting, in quotes, transgender ideology, gender theory, or gender neutral pronouns. And this was across all educational settings, charter schools, K through 12, community colleges. And basically, it was kind of like that copy and paste, like what you had said earlier, in that all of these regulations used identical phrasing across each of the educational settings.
Okay, so this is definitely not just a policy shift, it's a full-on branding campaign change.
Yeah.
All right,
Absolutely.
so now let's move to Utah. Utah's changes were more about insurance coverage?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So there were multiple rules around insurance that barred coverage for gender reassignment surgery.
Mm.
Now, interestingly, earlier drafts went further banning coverage outright, but as the iterations went through, some of the language was softened, allowing now for a few exceptions for the Affordable Care Act Section 1557 compliance.
Okay, so even in aligned-ish states, we're seeing some pushback from the
Mhm.
legal or healthcare side.
Right.
So
Right.
now let's talk about the mountain states. What is happening in West Virginia and Wyoming?
Yeah, so West Virginia barred telehealth prescriptions for gender altering medications for minors and prohibits gender reassignment surgeries. Interestingly, West Virginia also chose to use the pronoun him across all documents to refer to all people. Which is an interesting on its own and a whole other podcast there. Wyoming, on the other hand, prohibits gender reassignment surgeries and ban puberty blockers and hormone therapy for minors with gender dysphoria.
Anytime I'm reading a bill and I notice that a state does that, it just brings me out of reading that bill so much because I am not a him. And I'm like, well, I guess this isn't for me.
Right, right. I mean, and that's the case. And if you think about it, for gender nonconforming individuals, they see her and him, and like, wait, that's not me either.
Right,
So,
right. Well,
mhm.
maybe these rules just don't apply to us and we can just keep living. All right, so let's look at the other side of this road trip that we're on. So there were states that pushed against this federal direction, right?
Absolutely. So we see Colorado, Illinois, Massachusetts, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Washington. They all implemented new protections or reaffirmed existing ones. So specifically, Colorado said that gender nonconforming individuals must receive equal care, treatment, and the same respect as gender conforming individuals. Illinois and Oregon had said that sexual orientation and gender identity cannot be used as grounds for discrimination in foster care or adult treatment homes or centers. Massachusetts specifically said that healthcare providers offering gender affirming care are legally protected. Pennsylvania prohibits conversion therapy for minors. And then we already talked about Texas, and we're going to talk about Washington here in a minute.
So basically, these policies are touching almost every part of our lived experience. Just listening to those few
Mhm.
things, you're like, I wouldn't have thought of foster care. I wouldn't have thought of all of these
Yeah.
different things. And with these people, it's essentially the same federal prompt, but just kind of a completely opposite reaction.
Mhm.
All right, let's get into the Washington of it all. I've been on the edge of my seat since I've been wondering how can one be both? We heard a little bit about that on the Texas side, but we've mentioned it specifically a few times, and it's the only state to actually kind of name check an executive order. So what happened here?
Right. So you're absolutely right. The state of Washington was the only jurisdiction to explicitly reference Executive Order 14168 in the regulatory notices. So, two notices related to Edmonds College address the withdrawal of emergency rules tied to the college's student code of conduct and the permanent rulemaking process for two chapters of the Washington Administrative Code. So, the original filings in 2024 cited compliance with the U.S. Department of Education's Title IX guidelines. And specifically, the withdrawal notices referenced a ruling by the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Kentucky vacating the 2024 Title IX rule. And then it also referenced the Executive Order 14168. And then it also referenced the Department of Education's Dear Colleague letter that was sent out on February 4th of 25, which also cited that ruling and the executive order. So with the Edmonds College, they were following along the Biden era policies, and then they reverted back once the current administration wrote these executive orders. And then on the other side of it, a subsequent Washington notice dated July 1st of 25 restricted the sharing of gender affirming treatment data or records with jurisdictions that ban or otherwise restrict gender affirming treatments to a degree inconsistent with Washington law.
Okay, so Washington was basically like, we'll comply. Psych. All right, so was that kind of rebound regulation unique to Washington, or do you think that we could see more states pivot like this as the legal dust settles?
Yeah, so my interpretation of these events is that the college was really trying to comply with the new federal rulings.
Hmm.
The state of Washington itself, though, is a state that has anti-discrimination laws to protect people in the LGBTQIA communities. So I think this is a case of where a college is trying to do something and trying to comply with federal Title IX rules, whereas the state is being consistent with their anti-discrimination laws. And
Hmm.
so having the colleges do something versus the state doing something, that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah. It's just another layer of preemption. So here we are. Patchworks on patchworks. All right. So you used Bill Track 50's regulatory tracker for this. Can you talk about what makes tracking regulations so valuable compared to just looking at laws or bills?
Yeah, absolutely. So regulations are really like the implementation of the laws. They show how laws are applied in real life. And regulatory changes can happen really fast,
Hmm.
especially under new administrations, which is what we saw when President Trump became the president, and with all of those executive orders being signed on day one. Executive orders can really help us to identify early trends, such as terminology changes or healthcare exclusions. As I was reading through some of the other subsequent executive orders around healthcare, they referred to things that were going on possibly within the states. Now, I didn't dive into that very well, so I can't give you the nuances there, but they appeared to be responding to what was happening at the state regulatory level. And overall, looking at regulations, I mean, that's really a great tool for advocacy because you can have more immediate effect, more immediate change. These regulations can show ripple effects in real time.
Right, and it's kind of a way that we could even use it for tracking bills better, where we know at the beginning of the year we might want to put biological definition in there, or this chemical warfare on children in there, and getting the chemicals and surgical mutilation. Those are words that we would want to start tracking for to see which
Yeah.
states are proposing bills that include these new words. So it's kind of, I don't know, an early warning, detect our radar for us policy junkies.
Yeah, and I think that makes a really great point because I did not look at bills that were being
Hmm.
introduced across the states. I went into the regulatory level there
Yeah.
to looking to see if there were any changes. I would recommend, like, if people were really curious about it, to do exactly what you said and to use Bill Track 50's software to track bills to see if they're using those terms chemical and mutilation and a biological truth, and to see if there are bills that are emerging now using that same language.
Well, I think that would help people a lot. So, okay.
Yes.
When you zoomed out, what's your bigger takeaway here? Is this just kind of a new state federal dynamic we're seeing, or is this just the latest round in our never-ending round of tug of war between administrations as we continue going back and forth.
Yeah, and we're definitely seeing policy polarization deepen. And I would argue that specifically even in the world of family, and states are no longer waiting for Congress to make decisions. They're reacting directly to the executive tone. And what we're really seeing is this defining legal language divide around sex or biological truth versus gender or gender identity. Washington is just one of those states that exemplifies how fast and fluid the regulatory environment has become. But we are, if you're looking at executive orders at the federal level, we're seeing that fast-paced changes as well.
Yeah, I love the executive tone call out there. That's something I haven't quite thought of. And I'm like, oh, that's a good one. I know. Keep that away in my little brain for later. And this is also just kind of a reminder that a lot of times we're seeing headlines as it relates to laws that are passed. And Stephen and I talk all the time about just what a low percentage of laws even get voted on, nevertheless get passed. So regulations are definitely quietly reshaping reality. And it seems to me like there might be a little bit of a through line here of our Congress's inability to act, and then the executive branch kind of taking a different way to pursue their initiatives that doesn't necessarily rely on Congress, and the states are reacting whether Congress is, hearing them or not.
Absolutely. And this is only one topic and how that's happening. You just watch the news and you can see that happening across a lot of different topics.
Yes, no, it's been a wild ride this year. I say that every year that I have been a part of Build Track 50, and it's only gotten wilder. So
Yep. Sure.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for coming here and unpacking this complex topic and this web of federal orders and state reactions. And this has just been completely illuminating. It's been so lovely to have you here. And whether states are kind of aligning with DC or rebelling against it, one thing is really clear. The policy battles over gender and identity are really far from over.
Absolutely. And Sarah, thank you so much for having me here today. It's been a pleasure, so much fun, and maybe we'll be able to do this again.
Oh, absolutely. I think this was a great reminder for us to all continue looking beyond that bill number all the way over to regulations to see that executive tone. So this has been amazing, and thank you so much. We'll catch you all next week. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and check out this blog on BuildTrack50.com. And just remember that somewhere a librarian in Alabama just hid another copy of Genderqueer Behind the Great Gatsby.